O Agenciamentos Contemporâneos é uma iniciativa do Laboratório de Filosofia, Ciências Humanas e outros sistemas de pensamento, que conta com a parceria do Programa de Pós-Graduação Profissional em Filosofia, Núcleo Montes Claros, e o apoio da Coordenação Didática do curso de Filosofia da Unimontes. O Agenciamentos Contemporâneos procura abrir espaço para que pesquisadores, vinculados à academia ou não, possam apresentar suas considerações sobre problemas relevantes, privilegiando uma conversação transversal com um pensamento conectado à pesquisa, ao ensino e demais práticas cotidianas. O Agenciamentos Contemporâneos.
Boa noite a todos. A gente abre agora a nossa conferência de encerramento do 4º Encontro Internacional de Pós-Graduação em Filosofia da Universidade Federal de São Paulo. Eu estou muito feliz de estar nessa mesa, muito feliz pela semana também que a gente teve, com várias mesas muito legais, com debates muito interessantes. Muito obrigada, equipe, muito obrigada, colegas, por essa oportunidade e por termos conseguido colocar esse encontro, né? Realizar esse encontro. E agora a gente tem a honra de ter o professor Olúfẹ aqui com a gente. Eu quero agradecer a presença de todo mundo que está aqui assistindo. Eu vou chamar também o meu colega Vitor Paixão, que vai estar mediando essa mesa junto comigo, para fazer os agradecimentos para o professor.
Thanks. We're very happy to have you here, Professor. It's very good to have your talk in this closing ceremony, especially because it really talks with the themes we were working in this event. So we're thanking you again. I hope you have a great talk and we have a great discussion about your work. You can present the themes you're talking, and you can present yourself for our audience. So we can start the conversation. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Thank you to everybody at the university, to Paula and Monize and Vitor for putting this together. I'm really glad to be able to talk with all of you. And I want to talk about colonialism. That's the title of the talk. What is new? What is neo about colonialism? But really, more generally, what is new about the 21st century, and how should we think about it politically, as theorists, as philosophers, as thinkers, intellectuals, trying to decide how to respond to a very new set of circumstances? So I will start by giving a brief introduction to this topic as I understand it. I will give a description of history and the different role of the state system and of states and governments in the past. And I will try to say what I think is different about the contemporary moment, about today. And then I'll say a little bit about why I think it matters. So starting off with the introduction. Like many of you, I find lots about the world very disappointing. I wish the world were different. I think the world is unjust. I think the world is oppressive. And I think that requires changing who and what is in charge. But one thing I've been surprised about, even as I meet a lot of other people in the academy, particularly the Anglophone Academy, but not exclusively English speakers, but particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, there's not as much interest in figuring out who is in charge, who is the ruling class, as I would have guessed. And when speaking to other colleagues, some of whom are in the academy and some of whom are outside of the academy, but still very intellectually involved in other circles, in both of these kinds of spaces, there's less interest in figuring out who rules the world, who has political authority, than I would have guessed. On the left side of the screen, you see a quote from Doug Henwood, who is a very well-known Marxist journalist and thinker. And he says, Marxists don't write about the ruling class. He's quoting a Marxist political scientist, Bertel Ohlmann, who said that. And he asks Ohlmann why Marxists don't write about the ruling class. And Ohlmann says that they think it's obvious. And Henwood, like me, does not think it's quite so obvious. And I think that's related to another development in politics over the last few centuries, which is the development of the state system. So states, countries, national governments take themselves to have something like supreme authority, at least within their geographical territory. And this is not only an assumption of states and the state system, but actually many political theorists who study politics take themselves to study the state and the decisions of states and have inherited to some degree, many unreflectively, but some even reflectively, the presumption, the assumption, the idea that the major borders between states are the borders between political systems. So they take the question of who has authority to be answered by what state you are in. So is this in fact obvious? Should we think that we know who is in charge? And should we think that we have ready-made political ideologies for dealing with the various structural problems of the world and how the world is organized? I follow thinkers like Murray Bookchin in thinking that we should be updating and changing our basic understanding of the ideological and political categories as history shifts. So we can learn a lot from previous developments in political economy and political ideology, but our learning from those should be dynamic. So on the left, you see a quote where he alleges that treating Marxism, anarchism, or syndicalism as immortal would be obstructive to the development of a relevant radical movement. It would get in the way. On the right, you see a quote from Andre Gunder Frank within a quote from Cedric Robinson. So Gunder Frank alleges that Marx and Weber and their followers failed to take a serious account of the entire world system that they were trying to theorize about, and instead fell prey to a sort of European exceptionalism. And Robinson seems to agree that people's understanding of historical materialism has not sufficiently taken into account the different kinds of experiences of the same era of colonialism and capitalism that we ought to take full stock of. Now, whether or not either Bookchin, Gunder Frank, or Robinson are being fair to Marxism or to anarchism or syndicalism is not my immediate interest today. What I am interested in is the reason why these ideologies may have left some things out, or why adherents of these ideological categories may have failed to take stock of certain aspects of our world economy. And that is, we need to look at the changing world rather directly and adjust our ideologies to fit it and its changes rather than adjusting our view of the world to fit our ideologies. So we've gotten the criteria fit backwards between political theories and the world we're trying to describe with those theories. So in keeping with that, I have been working on, with many colleagues who also agree, trying to keep track of what is different about this century than the centuries that preceded it. Elite capture is one work in which I have tried to think about these sorts of changes. And in a related essay, I wrote alongside my colleague Enzo Rossi, we're trying to figure out what has changed in the material structure of capitalism and in the ideological superstructure of the way that people think and respond to and culturally organize themselves around capitalism. And one of the changes we think has happened is a more probabilistic connection between the overlapping categories of class and race, more probabilistic in the 21st century than in the 20th century. And we may or may not be correct about this, but I just want to give this as an example of trying to take stock of serious politically meaningful changes in how the world system operates. So this is one of the things that would, one of the topics that would come up if you're trying to keep track of those changes. But the topic for today is about colonialism. So I want to try and think about how colonialism, the actual phenomenon and our understanding of it, ought to shift in the 21st century compared with the 20th and the 19th and the 18th. And so I should start by being clear about how it is I am thinking about colonialism for the purpose of this talk. There's many ways of thinking about colonialism, of defining colonialism, and in particular of categorizing what's wrong with colonialism. And so there are some normative, moral characterizations of the phenomenon of colonialism that are out there that are maybe useful for other purposes. On the left, you see one such categorization by my colleague Leah Upi. But for my purposes, I'm more interested in the kind of political characterizations that you see on the right, characterizations by people like Amilcar Cabral and Vladimir Lenin, who are describing political arrangements of power between empires, between flows of capital, and between people who are dominated by both of the aforementioned. So it's the political kind of categorization that I'm trying to keep track of. And I'm just flagging for the purposes of this talk, in particular, that when both Cabral and Lenin are talking about colonialism, they are responding to the actions of states. So much of the world, as we all know, was under the colonial control of a handful of imperial states throughout much of the 20th century, in particular before the Second World War. And that division of the world was also the subject of the work on imperialism that I'm quoting from in the case of Lenin. So one of the things that I think is meaningfully different and that is already getting discussion from people around the world, particularly in the field of economics, especially those who do economics from a more heterodox and left standpoint, is the different political relationship developing in the post-neo-colonial, or I suppose we could say a development in the neo-colonial era, and maybe to the same point in the post-neoliberal era. One of the things that's emerging as the world economy develops is something that Dongo Sambasila and Daniela Gabor describe as a transformation of the role of the state in global capitalism. So rather than crafting the world for the purpose of multinational corporations, and rather than outright direct privatization of social services in the way that would have been identified with Margaret Thatcher and her ideological aficionados, what's happening in the Wall Street consensus, as they categorize it, is something that transforms the state into something that de-risks investments for global financiers. So it has a more targeted and more narrow role in securitization of portfolio and the guaranteeing of a stable range of returns for financiers, rather than having a more direct world crafting role as the state had in earlier eras. If that is indeed an apt categorization of where we've gone politically, that indeed seems to be something of a new development or an emerging development. So the proposal, the thing that I'm going to defend in this talk, the idea that I'm going to go for, is that there is something new about neo-colonialism since 1965, and I'd like to characterize that as the relative position of state and capital. So this should hopefully sound familiar. This is something like, the underlying move here that we should make sure to keep track of the roles that state and capital play with respect to each other, and not simply assume that one is a mere functionary of the other, should be familiar, especially to those who are familiar with the work of Nkrumah and much of the work responding to it in subsequent eras of scholarship. So Kwame Nkrumah, as many of you I would bet know, was the first president of Ghana. He was the chairperson of the Organization of African Unity, which became the African Union, and he's a philosopher and anti-colonial political actor who's very important in the 20th century. And I want to borrow his thinking about neo-colonialism to set up this thing that I'm trying to defend. So that requires me to talk about if I think the relative position of state and capital has changed, what the relative position of state and capital used to be. And this is obviously a broad, sweeping categorization. There's much to trouble it in respect to specific colonies or specific colony metropole relationships. But broadly, I think it is fair to say that in the emerging world order that began as the colonial conquests of the Western Hemisphere by European powers took off in the 15th century, was broadly an era of state-led politics, which was structured around imperial ends. So the monitoring, the establishment of colonies, the economic management of those colonies was broadly subservient to state interests. The revolutionary struggles of the 18th century, beginning with the United States, France, and Haitian revolutions, and continuing with the Latin American wars of independence in Spanish America, and as you all well know, Portuguese-controlled colonies in the Americas, were largely about challenging the control of then European empires or undue influence of the then European empires over economic, political, and cultural affairs in the colonies. And these struggles took place starting again in the late 18th century, but culminating in the 20th century wars of independence in Asia and Africa. But in this period, empires attempted, and in many cases largely succeeded, at shaping the development of the world economy, the integration of new geographic territory into the circuits of the flows of capital, and thus into the network of capitalist production, and did so by somewhat state-controlled means. And here, for one striking example, I would refer people to another work by Dongo Sambasila with co-author Fanny Pigode called Africa's Last Colonial Currency. But in the 20th century, this is challenged by a number of developments. Through to the First World War, the empires were still doing the business of shaping and splitting the world in between them. But this was starting to be challenged in large part due to the influence by another axis of world integration into planetary politics that was represented by the Third International, established by Lenin and established by the Bolsheviks in the wake of the Russian Revolution. And this, of course, precipitated the Cold War and the splitting of the world into the First World, aligned with the United States and the United Kingdom, the Second World, allied with the Soviet Union, and the Third World, allied in many cases with what was then termed the non-aligned movement. In the aftermath of the Second World War, things began to change. So the Bretton Woods Conference was established. Many of the important multinational institutions have their roots from this conference in 1944, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And so even while national independence movements greatly increased the number of states, which more than tripled between the decades preceding the Second World War and the 1960s, when Kwame Nkrumah writes Neo-Colonialism, there is at the same time a multinational system of governance being built up between the United Nations, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and other such organizations, and trying to reshift the balance of power and answer the question of how world economic relationships and political relationships are to be managed in a world where there are no longer a handful of ascendant empires making direct or indirect political decisions for the rest of the world. I think that's plenty on this, so let me skip to here. So in just a quick summary of what's been said, a world market develops in the time between Christopher Columbus and the Spanish conquest of Manila. As that world market develops, a world political system develops that is integrating many of the territories of the world into linked economic production that is eventually turned into capitalist production. And those economic links are managed by an emerging state system, which, starting with the revolutions in the United States, France, and Haiti, and extending to the revolutions in Africa and Asia of the 20th century, those revolutions involve linkages between independent states who have the relevant modern economic managements of central banks and state legislatures, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, supranational institutions develop as the number of states proliferate, and the question emerges of how these new economic relationships, marred by new political relationships, are to be managed. So in the past, the ruling ideology, the ruling version of economic management was explicitly state organized. The ruling economic management philosophy of the day was mercantilism. So states were trying to wage wars initiate economic protectionist strategies like tariffs and piracy, and manage their colonies for the benefit of the metropole, for the mother country. Much of the management of the slave trade and colonial commerce was done explicitly towards this end. But something changes, and that change is the thing, by my reading, that Kwame Nkrumah was trying to start keeping track of as early as the 1960s. And he's, of course, not the only person who was thinking about this then, but his discussion of this subject line is very well known and very historically influential. And what Nkrumah says is that neocolonialism has changed something about what it means to be a state, at least for these emerging independent states that are finding their footing as nationally independent in the emerging 20th century and the wane of formal colonial domination. So a state of formerly colonial subjects will have the outward trappings of international sovereignty. They will have a flag and they will have ministers and they might even have elections. But they don't have the actual control over their economic and political destiny that, say, the Ottoman Empire or the Russian Empire or the French Empire or the British Empire had as a result of having a flag and national sovereignty in previous centuries. There's something different about what it means to be a state, at least for these third world states or global South states, as we would say now. What I'm trying to bring this into conversation with is a long-standing conversation about the theory of the state, and in particular, what I think is fair to characterize as the Marxist theory of the state, following Marxist thinkers like Fred Bloch. And one school of thought within the umbrella of Marxian thinking is the idea that the state is somehow subservient to or simply an engine of the capitalists. And we could run this different ways. Maybe the Brazilian state is the engine of Brazilian capitalists, or maybe it's the engine of capitalists writ large, global capitalists, and just is their engine in the geographic territory of Brazil specifically. But there's some family of ideas that says what the state is simply a mouthpiece and a rubber stamp for the capitalist class. And there's many critiques of that way of looking at the state, and many different ways of running an analysis of what the state is, perhaps most famously the one offered by Gramsci and the Gramscians. But Nkrumah's critique in particular is based on the specific historically contingent role of African capitalists in particular, and thus of African states. Whatever African capitalists are, do not have the same relationship to capital and thus to the machinery of the state as, say, the German capitalists had in the previous century. And so as a result, whatever the state is, it is unlikely to be subservient to African capitalists in the way that people may have theorized that the German state or the Italian state or the French state was subservient to their respective capitalists. Unlike those capitalists, African capitalists are, Nkrumah says, junior partners of imperialism. They receive a small amount of profits. They don't wield the social or political power that is thought to be part and parcel of being members of the capitalist class, and so they are not a ruling class in the same respect that their counterparts in Germany or France might be. So to borrow a phrase from the African-American sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, African capitalists can be called a lumpen bourgeoisie, right? They have the position of bourgeoisie relative to their fellow Africans, but in terms of their powers as bourgeoisie, those powers are absent or at the very least greatly reduced. So the African bourgeoisie does not have the autonomy associated with the bourgeois. And so they could not be a ruling class in the way that is tied to at least this understanding of what a ruling class is that Fred Bloch is describing. And here Peter Eke, the Nigerian political philosopher, is making a very similar point to the one made by Nkrumah a few years earlier. So what else is wrong with this view of the state? Well, Bloch's criticism and Bloch's alternative framework is to think, perhaps alongside some famous criticisms of the Marxist tradition from groups like the anarchists and the syndicalists, is to think of the state as having some sort of political autonomy, and to think of capitalism, therefore, as, here he's simplifying, but as, in general, the outcome of a conflict between three sets of agents. So the capitalist class is something of a distinct politico-economic class with its own set of interests in both the economic and political sphere. The same is true of the managers of the state apparatus. So political elites are thought to be related to, but ultimately distinct from, bourgeois elites. And the working class is the third group. So the proletariat is, of course, its own source of political efficacy, in keeping with Marxist tradition. So this is Bloch's attempt to update the Marxist analysis to take into account some new developments in political economy and political theory. Okay, so all I want to call attention to here is that everything I just mentioned, all that theory is from the 60s and 70s. Some of those thinkers, Nkrumah, Eke, are making predictions, but also they're describing in the present tense things that they see on the African continent and in general. And Fred Bloch is doing the same in the late 1970s when he writes this critique. So, relative to the longer stretch of history that I described earlier, what do these thinkers think is neo about neocolonialism? And I think what they're responding to is the beginning of a process that we can now see more clearly given the benefit of decades since all of these people were writing. But I would categorize what they're responding to as the beginning of the eclipse of the state and of the state system. And credit where credit is due, I think Nkrumah more or less says this. So he's predicting that finance capital, this vast sprawling network of intercontinental activity, is going to, in and of itself, in a direct way, and not mediated through imperialist political powers, not mediated through imperialist flags, not mediated through the British Crown or the French legislature, but finance capital itself will acquire the kind of political dominance that colonialism and colonialists and colonizers once had. The thing that's changing as the anti-colonial struggles are won is, of course, which flags there are and who has a seat at the United Nations. But that is not a uniformly positive development. At least the imperial power has to explain themselves because colonizers are people. Finance capital as a sort of impersonal, fully abstract motive and organizing force can be held to no such kind of accountability. And in that sense, neocolonialism represents an intensification of rather than a setback towards colonial domination. And seeing this, revisiting this some decades later, I think there's much to be said for the prediction that Nkrumah makes. So now on the left side of the screen, you see the kind of description of the African political elite and the connection of that political elite to political elites elsewhere that Nkrumah was warning us about decades ago. So on the left, Scylla and Gabor are describing public-private partnerships. That's what PPP stands for. And they're describing the way that public-private partnerships essentially offload risks from investors to African states and consequently to Africans, while insulating the shareholders who are bankrolling infrastructure projects in Africa and throughout the African continent, insulating their portfolios from downside risk. And so this is not only a form of de-risking investments and a form of protecting shareholders, but it is also a form of governance, because the risks that those shareholders will and will not accept are the terms on which African states can access capital to build their infrastructure and participate in quote unquote economic development. And not just Nkrumah, but decades before Nkrumah, Eric Williams was making the same kind of long-run prediction. And not just long-run prediction, but description of the transition from mercantilism. This is arguably already underway as we transition from mercantilist rule of imperial economies to something in the direction of free trade. And of course, there's always been barriers to trade, but the relative power shifting towards companies, towards capital itself, rather than being mediated through state-run projects. So what's happening is that as countries and people get free, first in the 1800s, United States, Haiti, Spanish America, Brazil, as those states become free, the economies that they manage are also becoming free, and free in the sense that capitalism cares about. They are becoming free to receive capital and to participate in a more and more direct and more unfettered fashion in global planetary scale capitalist production. So skipping here, what I would say about this now is that what's about neocolonialism is simply the further development and arguably the completion of the developments in the world economy that Nkrumah and Eke, and even from his perspective, Bloch, were predicting for the decades to come. The state and the state system have been eclipsed by capitalism. That is new. That had not happened already by the time they were writing. At the time they were writing, the state system was still ascendant. Political competition, in particular between the first world and the second world, was still very directly of consequence and of primary consequence. And this new development where capital as such has a primary driver's seat in the direction of politics the world over, that's new. Maybe this is the thing Fukuyama was saying, who knows? But in any event, to simplify this, I would just try to say this directly in this way. Bloch conjectures that there are three sets of agents: the state, the capital, and workers. And if we add on to that a kind of hierarchy, then we could say that in the 20th century, for the majority of the 20th century, states and competition between states had a sort of primary political organizing role, underneath which was capital, underneath which were, of course, the workers. and the relative positions, so this is just making precise the very claim, the central claim I started off with, relative positions of the state and capital have switched. So now the world over, most obviously in the global south, but even in the global north, we are increasingly in a world where it is capital as such that is in the driver's seat in terms of history, and perhaps capitalists as a class. So this is just setting this read of block next to the Bloch's reformulated Marxist theory of the state. So the people who run the state apparatus have to think directly about the reproduction of the social order, and capitalists do not necessarily. Though the state tends to serve the interests of capitalists as a class, they have something of autonomy in how they do that and how they understand how that is to be done, and is in view partially of those things that you might describe the three sets of agents in the 20th century as being in this order, having the states and the state managers having a sort of primary role in deciding the course of history. And so I'm merely proposing to think of this as a hierarchical ranking. And you might understand that hierarchical ranking as, a set of ordering relations. So, of course, we could just describe it flat-footedly as relative power, where states and state managers are maybe more important, particularly the more powerful the state is in determining outcomes than capitalists, who are in turn in a relationship of domination over workers. But we could understand that, I think, a bit more precisely, particularly looking at the history of colonialism. And we could describe that as a set of underdetermination relationships. So states determine where capital can go and where people can go, maybe just as importantly. Capitalists determine how economic activity will be organized, where people and capital can go, so subject to the constraints set by states. This is particularly, I think, explicitly true of the mercantilist era, and I think this is a truth about the world economy that holds on through the 20th century. And then from there, workers determine the course of class struggle, subject to the constraints imposed upon them by the state and by capital. And so, I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A, but I think this is an interpretation that makes sense, in particular, of the debates within Russian Marxism, particularly at the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, and indeed some more recent debates, in particular between the Stalinist South Africans and the supporters of what came to be known as the racial capitalism view, just to give two examples of debates where this might be clarifying. But I think something like this is the way people are thinking. And so what might be new about neo-colonialism, if I am right, which involves a reading of some of the additional theoretical apparatus offered to us by our colleagues in economics and other social sciences, economics and history, is that it might be capitalists in this era who are doing the underdetermination relationship. So it might be capitalists that are constructing the terrain of economic and political activity across borders through their ability to exercise both veto and control-like design powers on states. So here, the public-private partnership example is an example of capital exerting sort of direct terrain-making power on states. There will be these bridges and these toll roads and so on and so forth, and directly participating in the design process that otherwise might have been left to state legislatures. And within those constraints imposed by capital, states get to determine whether to, ratchet up economic activity within the parameters set by capital and subject to the economic constraints imposed by capital. So to give another example of what I'm thinking here, embargoes on Cuba and Venezuela, capital flight in Zimbabwe after land reform by Mugabe's ZANU-PF. These forms of leverage are now decisive, and of course, structural adjustment imposed by the International Monetary Fund, but the capital directly and the apportionment of capital is the thing that constrains states rather than the other way around. This is more obviously true in the global South, as I've been saying, but I think it is beginning to emerge as a clear truth even in the global North. And yet again, workers determine the course of class struggle subject to these constraints by the state and capital. So again, that is the hierarchy given on the right, where capital is in the driver's seat, giving this most basic set of constraints, underneath which is the state, underneath which are workers and the working class. So this is, again, the difference, the relative position of the state and of capital. So to continue to make the point directly here, I'm drawing from work by Benjamin Braun and Adrian Buller, who have been writing convincing work about a new era in capitalism. So an update to the way that capitalism functions, as we should be interested in thinking about. They characterize the era that we're in as asset manager capitalism, named after, of course, asset managers, the new institutions that acquire management responsibility for large country-sized blocks of capital in the case of the largest asset managers. So pooling the contributions from institutional investors like pension funds and venture capital in some case, and these intermediaries invest on behalf of those clients of theirs. Because they control so much capital, they acquire by that economic power the direct kind of decision-making power that I talked about earlier. They are often at the decision-making table in institutional board meetings. They are large shareholders in culturally and economically important companies like fossil fuel companies, and they are often at the decision-making and bargaining table with states who are looking for financing for investment. And these asset managers think about economic performance differently, and so they govern differently. In particular, the kind of control that asset managers have is not merely the veto, but again, as I was saying in response to the previous slide, they have direct kind of control and design power. They work to generate investability, right? So they work to actively reshape the world so as to create investment opportunities and to stabilize returns to the investment opportunities that already exist. And both of those things simply mean constraining the actions of states and thereby the people that live in those states. Daniela Gabor in particular has developed a wide body of work that I think is very worth investigation about this new era of capitalism, and in particular the role of investors, in particular asset managers and institutional investors in reshaping what the state is and reshaping how they accumulate, so as to do so by shifting around risk and by creating zones of economic activity that are investable. So they create investment opportunities, and they do so by putting different people at risk, and in particular by shunting risk to states. So states become, a sort of investment arm for capital. And again, that is governance. That is what governance becomes. And it is interesting and perhaps grist for my mill. It is it helps make the case that I'm trying to make, that this is more or less what they say outright. So when the World Bank is talking about welfare and health and infrastructure and transportation and education worldwide, they are talking about how to shape all those basic human social needs around the need to escort institutional investors and their asset managers towards these opportunities, and maybe more to the point, how to make welfare and health and infrastructure into opportunities, into investable opportunities in the first place, right? Which means structuring them so as to make them the sorts of things that could appreciate in value according to an economic logic, and redirect the gain from that value into the private hands of people that own shares in something or other, whether it's a business that is helping provide or providing those needs via capitalist exchange, or whether it is a government that is doing so in a way that generates revenue that can be used to compensate the investors who helped finance the infrastructure in the first place. So the public-private partnership, for example, generating toll roads where the tolls go to pay investors. But the question of whether or not to build a road, or whether or not to build a school, or whether or not to invest in health becomes a question of how to generate stable returns for some portfolio manager somewhere in the world. And again, this is, I think, just squarely what Nkrumah says. There's not even the semblance of, there's not even the appearance of genuinely democratic relationship between asset managers or institutional investors and the countries that are being shaped by the need to generate stable returns. There are parts of the world where this kind of encroachment on public decision-making power and democratic power is at least resisted to some extent. So France, but Francophone West Africa, on the other hand, or I should say Francophone Africa in general, not so much. So we are seeing the relative position of capital and state change most quickly and most obviously in the global South, on the African continent in particular, but it is indeed happening on a planetary scale. So I don't think there's much to say here, just to point out that everything's being re-engineered for capital. So, okay. I don't want to speak for too much longer, but I do want to cover some objections and think about how we might respond from the point of view of theorists. Okay, I'll just go through this quickly, but some people might be mad that the Marxist theory of the state is being reformulated at all, because maybe they fear that what's being challenged is not the Marxist theory of the state, not an element of Marxism, but Marxism itself. How do we square this challenge to Marxist theory with a commitment to Marxism? And my answer is, maybe we don't. Whatever. Okay. But I actually think this is quite in line with the old story of Marxist domination. Is for this reason that Lenin bothered to write a tract about colonialism, and why he bothered to, say, overthrow an empire, which is what the Russian Revolution was. And so keeping track of the relative relationship of the state and capital seems very par for the course in Marxist theory, and much more importantly, the history of Marxist praxis as I understand it. But again, whatever. Okay. So the second objection is that maybe everything I presented here is a reason to go back to the orthodox Marxist theory of the state that Bloch was disagreeing with, right? So the kind of flat-footed Marxist, the orthodox Marxist theory said that the state is just an engine, an arm of capital. And I gave reasons in the first half of this lecture to think that for much of recent history, for much of the last 5 centuries, that the state was in the driver's seat. Whether the newly independent states of the United States and the Latin American, the Spanish American and Brazilian new states of the 19th century, or the old empires of Europe and the Ottomans, those people were in charge. But you might think this new stuff about asset manager capital really vindicates the orthodox theory of the state. So asset managers represent the interests of capitalism and of capital as a whole. And so now, even if it wasn't true in the 1800s that the state merely exercised the will of capital, maybe it's true now, and maybe that's what it comes to, that asset managers are at the decision-making table controlling what state governments do. But I am not sure that that is correct. What the asset manager capitalism theory gets us, what it shows us, is that the broad constraints of social life, the material development under which people fight for health and water and education, that those constraints are directly set, increasingly directly set by capital. So capital gets to decide whether you have a road, whether you have a hospital, and those things are very important and decisive of aspects of social life. But the broader political and economic order is, of course, not reducible to these questions of whether or not there is an investable toll road or an investable hospital in your district. Unlike the colonizers, asset managers, as far as I can tell, and I think the going theory so far tends in this direction, asset managers are not interested in political and economic order writ large, and is certainly only indirectly, when at all, relevant to the returns on their portfolio. What they are interested in is investability. And so they don't have an analogous interest in political and economic order in general that the colonizer has to have in order to maintain a foreign territory as a colony. So it is a version of rule that is actually quite unlike the Marxist theory of the state, because what the Marxist theory of the state was trying to describe was the way in which social order and the ruling class that imposes social order and defines social order relates to capital as a force. So I don't think the orthodox Marxist theory of the state is vindicated, even if we restrict the scope of analysis to post-1960s. Okay, so for now, I want to skip to why it matters, and then I will open it up for Q&A. So broadly, as political philosophers, as theorists, as thinkers, I think we should be trying to understand the world around us. We should be trying to shape the discussions that we have about politics around the questions as they actually map onto the structure of the world. And that asks us to be attentive to things that are changing in the basic fundamental political relationships around us. I think this means that we need to give up on methodological nationalism, not only because it makes too much of a big deal of the differences between countries, but because if the preceding analysis is right, it really doesn't latch on at all to what the ruling political powers are in different parts of the world. If the ruling class is some kind of coalition between institutional investors and a set of political elites, that just isn't in any way, shape, or form the state, right? So it's not the state of Brazil or the state of Namibia or the state of Nigeria or the state of Thailand that rules in any particular place, but it's some coalition that involves state managers of those places, that involves sections of the World Bank and the IMF, and that involves shareholders and institutional investors and some melange of actors there. And I think that particularly now I'm speaking as a political philosopher, I think that for decades, our colleagues in other disciplines have just already seen this, and we just need to catch up with them. So political philosophy in other disciplines, other descriptors of global governance challenges are already thinking about political institutions in more complex ways, and so should we. But more importantly, not thinking as a theorist and just thinking as a person who lives in the world, I think the bigger problem posed by this potential analysis of our political system is that it's unclear what the analogous movement of the anti-colonial movement of the 20th century really ought to be. You knew where the Tsar lived, and you knew where the Portuguese Air Force had their bombers and where they were launching from. If you are in a war with an empire, it is clear what victory looks like, and it is clear what progress looks like, so on and so forth. It is not clear how one engages in battle or political contest with a pension fund or with institutional investors. So I think the prescriptive side of this discussion, what is it that we do in this political era, is of paramount importance. And that's something that many of us are already thinking about, but I think even more of us could be thinking about. And I will just quickly describe a few kinds of thoughts that people that I've learned by reading work of my colleagues. And one set of discussions that would be worth starting to have is about what distributed democratic planning might look like, such that it is people rather than shareholders or even the political elites who are state managers get to decide the shape of their lives. And there are benefits from centralized democratic decision-making. There are benefits from decentralized democratic decision-making, but there's a whole spectrum of ways of organizing things that one can start to consider. And as I'm sure most in the audience knows, one of the famous ways that's getting around the world of thinking about democratic decision-making is participatory budgeting, which was tried out first and pioneered by Ph.D. in Porto Alegre, and is something that people have been thinking about in other contexts in response to broader political issues. And of course, public ownership is in particular of things, of aspects of the economy with deep ecological importance, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, direct democratic and rather public ownership is another topic area that I think is probably worth consideration. That's another way to eliminate or at least radically change the organizing role of shareholders and shareholder capital in the organization of society. And the recent Build Public Renewables Act in New York, I think, offers an example of some political directions that are worth studying. So I will end there, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm speechless, actually. Thank you so much for sharing your work and your knowledge with us. There is many important points here. I do have a question for you. I think Vitor also has one, or?
Yeah, I have.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can start the conversation.
Good.
You made the distinction between the bourgeois in places like United States and in England, where we have this dominance, and place like Brazil and Africa, where we have what you call lumpen bourgeois. And what I was thinking when you were talking is, you say that what's new about new colonialism in the 21st century is that the change in relative position between the state and capital. Uh, do you think that this change happens even in these places in the third world, where the dominant class is not really dominant and is responding to capital in the first world? Do you think that even in places like Brazil and another third world countries, the changing relative position between the local bourgeois and state happening?
Yeah, I think that the change in relative position between the state and capital is happening unevenly, right? So it will be quicker in some parts of the world than others. Nkrumah thinks it was so quick that you basically started there in most parts of Africa. And I would say probably in the richest and most powerful countries, the United States, but even countries like Norway with sovereign wealth funds, and maybe some of the Gulf states, I think you could say that the state has retained ascendancy over capital. At least state managers as a group have retained ascendancy over the local capitalists. But I think I would guess that eventually the world will look more and more like Africa, but most parts of the world are somewhere in between those extremes. And I would guess that Brazil and India and Indonesia are somewhere in between.
Thank you. I will let Monize make her question, and I came back later.
Thank you. Professor, I do have a point that I would like to know your opinion about. I mean, we are in 21, it's 2023, you know, it's, and we are still watching a colonial process happening. And we have never talked that much about human rights. And we know how this process kills the human dignity. And I would like to know your opinion about the impact or the role of the human rights in this process, especially the UN. I mean, if they do have impact, what do you think about it? How they impact this? I mean, positively or negatively?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's easy to be cynical about the role of human rights, especially as someone from the United States of America, which just, as far as I could tell, has no interest in, anything other than the optics of human rights. There's nothing like at the level of the state, there's nothing like a real tradition of solidarity, which is not true of the rest of the world. I think, we can have criticisms, and we should have criticisms of other governments, but other governments have managed to elect people that at least sometimes are willing to make stands for human rights. And so I don't want to say that human rights as a discourse or as a way of thinking is completely useless. I don't think that's true. But it is, especially with all the bombs being dropped on Gaza right now as we speak, it's very difficult to give a full-throated defense of human rights as a discourse either. I think we're going to need a more robust international system of solidarity, something at least with the spirit of the non-aligned movement. Dongo Silla often talks about having a Bandung Woods to respond to Bretton Woods and building an international order that way. But we need something like actual institutions and not just networks of activists who are in favor of solidarity and who are in favor of human rights. And I don't see anything like that happening yet.
Thank you for your answer. That I thought something
There
it.
There is a question in the chat.
Oh, good.
I will read it. Paola Luis asked, how you see and understand the advance of the ultra-right and fascism in Brazil and Latin America? And I like to put in their thinking in what you said and the way that we think on the capital in First World influence the politics in third world countries, and especially thinking how we see in recent elections and political movements or representation in democratic movement in Latin America and the influence of external capital in this process. I like to ask how you think that these things can look in your analysis.
So I'm very worried about the ultra right in places like Brazil. On the one hand, I think the left in Brazil is really admirable. MST in particular is something that a lot of us want to learn about and learn from, and so it's something that people are starting to pay attention to here. But especially given how recent the military dictatorship was, there was a book that came out here in the States, but also internationally, about the protest movements of the last decade or so. And it develops a few chapters talking about Movimento Passe Livre and the response of the Brazilian right to kind of co-opt the energy of it. And it's really scary, right? Because everything up to that point looks like, at least in the direction of something encouraging. And then the ultra-right manages to take over, and they have a long history of doing so in Brazil. So I think, Brazil and the far right in Brazil shows us both how present the danger of the far right is, but it also shows us how possible it is to maintain, fighting for democracy even when they're ascendant, right? The MST didn't disappear because Bolsonaro was elected, right? A lot of people fighting for democracy and equality didn't disappear because Bolsonaro won some ground. So I think, if nothing else, for those of us outside of Brazil, it helps to understand that people have been able to survive and maintain even with very strong levels of opposition from the right.
We hope. There's our hope.
Yeah,
Professor.
That's a great thought.
Yes. And it gives us hope to continue to be doing what we are doing. Is there any other question? I don't think so. Do you have another?
I have.
Good. Yeah.
Here and in your book, you talk a lot about how there is a problem to the perspective of racial capitalism. And you talk how we organize this movement, there's a problem in the way these movements organize, and how this is even a mathematical problem. There is no place for a racial capitalism movement to start and make changes in the balance of power in the structure of the capitalism. I was thinking about how you talk about this and how you include the LGBT movement and other movements, and how we can relate to these structures. Thinking what kind of movements we can make if we do not take this assimilationist path.
Yeah, I think one of the examples I've been talking about in the US is a movement of labor activism that people call bargaining for the common good here. But it's just an example of using unions more flexibly and more comprehensively, right? So I think there's an attitude in the US at least that says unions fight for wages and benefits for the people that are in the union, for the workers that are in the union, which is of course core and important and should never not be part of what a union fights for. But unions can also fight for community goals. They can negotiate and fight for broader protections and broader changes to social structure, especially public sector unions. And they can fight goals for the broader working class. And that is something that we're starting to see. And along with that is working these other goals, working these other social problems into how we do, quote unquote, orthodox left organizing or orthodox worker organizing. So workers as a union have bargained over sexual harassment policies as part of bargaining for the common good. They fought for immigration protection for students in teachers' unions. They fought against racist evictions policies in their tenants' unions and workers' unions. And I think the way to keep the way to prevent identity concerns from being wielded in a neoliberal way and wielded against broader justice is to make them part of the fight for broader justice, as many groups already have been doing. And I think, bargaining for the common good in the USA, I think MST in Brazil, I think a lot of the indigenous groups fighting for ecological groups or fighting for ecological justice in Ecuador, the Yasunidos. I think all these are examples of how we can use, how we can build broader movements, universalist movements, out of identity-based concerns by combining them rather than trying to assimilate them into homogenous politics.
Yeah, I think this is a great perspective. You talk about ecological movements, and you were talking about solidarity between unions and this identity movements. And I think that a great way to think about this in Brazil is the union that the Afro-Indigenous movements make to fight about ecology, especially thinking about laws like the Marco Temporal aqui no Brasil, here in Brazil, that is fought from the indigenous movement, from the Afro-Indigenous movement, from the people from Terreiros, and is also fought by movements like MTST that you just said. Do you think that we can think about these movements and this union of forces by the intersectionality perspective, thinking about how this battles unite those identity groups, and not only about a traditional perspective of left battles?
Yeah, I think we definitely should start by thinking about how these different battles can unite and combine, and even how they might not, and looking at that seriously. But But ultimately, whether we call it intersectionality or whether we're focused on the results, whether it's land back or quilombismo or whatever we're thinking about, I think we have to think about aligning goals as a strategy rather than something that we discover, right? So it's not as though it just happens to be the case that the goals of indigenous people line up with the workers' goals, but we should make it the case. And that's part of what solidarity is for. We should be trying to find ways of fighting for my goals that align with and help you get your goals, and the other way around as well. And that's something that has to be constructed rather than discovered.
Thank you for your answers. There is more questions. Monize?
I'm looking at the chat, but I think it's not other questions, so we can finish this roundtable and this conference. I think it's a perfect end for our conference. Thank you so much, Professor. It's a huge
really
pleasure.
An illuminating talk.
Yes,
it really was a perfect closer for your event.
Thanks for having
me. We are really happy to have you here, and we really hope that we can encounter you in Brazil presentially.
Definitely.
It will be great. I think it's we are closing with a flourish here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, really.
E eu gostaria de agradecer também a presença de todos os amigos e colegas que assistiram a gente, participaram com a gente durante essa semana. Também, especialmente, a nossa comissão organizadora. Muito obrigada a todos os nossos colegas. E a gente está encerrando a nossa semana, o nosso encontro internacional. Muito felizes, muito gratos por tudo que aconteceu. E obrigada, gente. Obrigada mesmo. Vitor, tem mais algum comentário?
Não, eu só gostaria de agradecer todo mundo que acompanhou a gente. Agradecer ao canal Agenciamentos Contemporâneos por ter sido nossa casa nesse evento. E agradecer de novo o professor Olúfẹ. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.